Alright, what's up guys? Sitting here with Bryce and we're going to play a little bit of min bet. I have actually played this session earlier and Bryce is going to point out how I am basically a min bet donkey throughout the match. So I'm going to give you my thought process. And basically all I have right now is raise every hand and do not fold. So we'll just go from there. Ace-8 suited, I guess I should be 3-betting probably my top 30% here. And seems like a good enough hand to 3-bet, so I 3-bet that. He calls on this turn. I'm just going to check fold. I don't think there's much value in tossing a bet given the pot size and the price that I'm laying.
And I think you're right there. I think that, again, against most strong opponents, you will have very little folding equity with one bet. Oftentimes, if they call the first bet, you might even consider the second bet, as you might find some opponents will lay down one pair no hard hand to 2 bets, but not 1 bet. I wouldn't say that betting again is a travesty, but against smart opponents, I think oftentimes you don't have much equity. Or much folding equity, that is.
Okay, here with the 9-8, flop top pair, and definitely turn open trips. It's easy bet the river. I considered check raising, see if I could get a 7 or I didn't know if a 6 would bet for value, probably not, so I just decided to go ahead and bet there.
And I think this is a really good bet. I think because of this board, one thing you'll find is a lot of people will call you down with king high, ace high hands or king high, ace high combo draws, and those hands certainly won't be value betting, so I think there is a lot more value in just going ahead and betting that river. Now, here's a common mistake, and I'm going to go ahead and pause the video here. In betting the turn here, there's very little that betting the turn accomplishes that you can't accomplish by just checking behind. And while I don't think your opponent's going to raise you too often on the turn here, I think I'd rather check behind and just not deal with that.
Okay.
And call it river bet if he bets.
Okay. My thought process was, since I have so much equity and a decent, maybe some showdown value, I could go ahead and bet there. Where's my thought process? Where did I mess up in my thinking?
I think that on the whole, when your opponent calls a bet there, you'll be you're going to be behind more often than not. Very seldom will your opponent be calling with a worse hand, such as a worse ace high. Most other hands, most draws will be raising. So I think you'll find that you won't really get much value out of betting that for a showdown. Now, if you really felt that was the case, you could always value bet again if your opponent chucked to you on the river and you thought that he would just always value bet any pair. And occasionally you might find opponents like that.
Okay.
But on the whole, you'd probably just check it behind if he checks to you. But the upside in here is you can also induce a bluff by checking behind. And it would feel very comfortable calling a river bet.
Okay. So your thought process basically, if you're going to bet the turn, you would want to be able to bet the river for value as well.
Well, conversely, that's a very good thought process, and that's a good rule of thumb. Oftentimes, in limit hold'em games when you're in position, a very good rule of thumb is if you have a hand that's not good enough to value bet the river, if your opponent calls your turn bet, consider checking behind and trying to induce a bluff and making sure that only 1 bet goes in the pot. And so that can be, again, a really strong rule of thumb.
And that's in small pots, because the bigger the pot, the more you have more value inducing a bluff in a small pot.
In very small pots, inducing a bluff is oftentimes more valuable than getting your opponent to fold a hand with, say, 6 outs.
Okay.
Now, in this situation, again, if we were on the turn and I had something like 8-9, I would certainly go ahead and bet, and that's a fantastic way to try and win the pot. But when you have some showdown value, this can be a stronger option most of the time.
Okay. Mistake number 1. We should count my mistakes. It's what the over-under on it is.
It doesn't really do too much good to count your mistakes, just to find what you can do better.
Okay, here with the kings, let's say if a brick rolls off, I would bet and call, and then call all the way,
You're out of position, and you're going to be betting and probably calling the whole way down if he raises. Okay. Again, it's limited hold'em, it's cheap to show your hands down, and you're out of position, so even if you have a worse hand, you may as well bet and make sure money goes in the times that you're behind and the times that you're ahead.
Okay. Here with the queens, 3-bet pre-flop. Now, I thought maybe on this turn that, in hindsight, right after I clicked bet, I thought maybe that my bet was a mistake, because if I checked, my thought process in hindsight was, well, if I check, he'll value bet so many hands for me. Like, I figure he'll value bet any pair that he has called with. I lose value from ace highs, but I don't get punished when he does have a good hand stronger than mine. So
it's an interesting point, and I think, well, one thing you'll find in limit hold'em is that your opponents are going to be calling you down with ace high quite a bit. It's just a hand that, because you have to spend so little to take it to showdown, can be very good on these dry flops where your range is wide, and he knows that you're going to be attacking the flop and turn with pretty much any 2 cards. Checking is not a bad option, especially if you thought that you could induce a bet from a float. It's not terrible, but oftentimes I would just be taking the lead here. And one thing I would find, especially at more advanced levels of play, is this is a board that I think a lot of my opponents might peel and raise a turn as a bluff. Low stakes games, I don't know if you find that too much, but especially with the high stakes games, the reason you call down is because your opponent might be bluffing some of the time. And if that assumption is correct, that means that you're getting subsidized in the sense that sometimes you're calling down with a worse hand, but sometimes you're also getting your opponent to put in extra money the times that you have the best hand.
Okay. He might even be able to raise a weaker hand for value there. Is that too far out of line?
No, I think that is maybe a bit out of line. I wouldn't be ludicrous. I think some people will do that, but I think it's a mistake.
Okay.
Although not necessarily a terrible one.
All right, 3 deuce. I didn't know if I should raise that or fold, but I figured it's
Let
not.
me hold them. That 3 deuce off, I would probably muck. But again, the mistake of playing 3 deuce off in position is extremely small. And against many opponents who fold their big blind a lot or play very conservative fitter fold style, that hand can certainly be played profitably. Of course, that means that any 2 cards could be played profitably.
Okay, but now I kind of got myself in a jam. I didn't know what to do here on the turn. I thought I had enough equity, and if he peels pretty light here, that I could go ahead and bet and call down. And then when the 5 rolls off on the river, the combos of hands that I now beat, given the price. I mean, I'm getting 9-1 here. So 11%.
Yeah.
Does he show me? Does he continue with a bluff?
Well, unfortunately, the 5 makes things really ugly. If that was a brick river, a 6 or an 8, I would probably almost certainly call a bet. Again, you're getting 9-1. He doesn't have to be bluffing with our semi-bluffing with a naked spade that often. But to think that on this board you have about probably something like 20% equity against a random hand, then we can say that his hand is quite a bit better than random. Well, he's got to be bluffing quite a bit to call this one down. So I would generally go ahead and muck on a 5 river here, a 7 river, probably a 10 river. But many blanket rivers I would call down as well.
Okay.
But your logic isn't completely flawed there in that it's a big pot, and there were some very good incentives for him to semi-bluff with some weak hands on the turn, which he can certainly hold. But on the whole, I think that it's just too thin to call this river bet.
Okay. I play so good.
That's right. Now this is a board that I probably wouldn't continuation bet. I like the fact that you check behind. This is a board that when your opponent just calls out a position, it's very easy. However, when your opponent checks it to you again, you've got a strong semi-bluff. Oftentimes you have an overcard and a flush draw.
Mm-hmm.
So I would take a stab. Sometimes you might be getting check raised, but it's one of those situations where I don't mind taking a stab in a situation like that.
Okay, but you would consider it a bluff, but you do have so much equity in the pot.
I would consider it a semi-bluff. And
Semi-bluff.
Yeah,
Okay.
again, you're committing basically a fraction of 1 bet
Yeah.
to win a pot, which only has 2 bets in it.
Okay.
But also some of the times your opponent holds nothing, and you're going to pick up the pot.
Okay.
And so it's not going to cost you much of the times you're behind.
See, I was thinking I had some maybe showdown value, but I guess if I had king or queen high, then it would be better to check back there and then bet my jack high.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. More with king and queen high. Oftentimes, if your opponent has a king or queen high with no heart here, he'll be letting the hand go if he has no pair. I think that we don't really have any questions about that. But if you happen to have the king of hearts, checking behind to maybe try and induce a bet is not a bad play. And it's interesting in that that might be the stronger play with the king of hearts, but with the jack of hearts, and especially a much lower heart, I like a bet.
Okay, excellent.
And you might even be able to consider a raise on the river here, and I like the fact that you did. I think that's very good, very observant, the fact that people's range, when they are betting there, is a lot of the times they hold any heart, and will pay off a raise.
Oh, hey, I get the third nuts. I got a raise.
That's good.
That's about as in depth as I was on that one. But he can have a bunch of hearts. I think it's. If I get 3-bet, I'd have to maybe throw that away. Oh.
You could consider it. I wouldn't make a habit of folding flushes on the river against people who you don't know. If you've played a couple thousand hands against a guy and you know that this guy is like Johnny Honesty, it's certainly something you can definitely consider doing is laying down your hand. But against people that you've only played a couple hands against, I'd really hate to fold that in such a big pot.
Okay. Now, I wasn't really sure about it. I know I need to be attacking some boards, and I was trying to look for boards that I didn't think hit his range too much, but I don't know if my frequencies of attacking had been correct.
Well,
so
frequency
far.
is something that you really micromanage, and as long as you're doing a bit of both, I think you can do whatever you do feel is instinctively correct. I think until you get into long matches, your actual frequencies don't really come into the light, in the sense that your opponent doesn't have a really good idea of what you're actually doing, so you can sort of fudge it in the meantime. And this is a good 3-bet that I think a lot of more amateur players don't make, in the sense that your opponent there can be raising with any pair and many semi-bluffs as well. And so the 3-bet is a very strong play in a situation like that.
I used to be a professional pooflinger.
That's true. And how long has it been since you played Limited Hold'em full time?
Oh man,
A long time?
18 months, probably.
Now here's a check raise that I don't think does too much for you. I don't think on this board you'll ever get a better hand to fold, so I don't think it's necessarily all that productive. So I would probably check call the first 2 streets pretty automatically, and then maybe make a decision about calling a river bet, depending on what I thought about my opponent.
Here on this, the ace queen, let's say if it just kind of bricked off, or if I didn't get raised, I was going to go 3 streets for value.
I think that's fantastic. As long as if your opponent flops a pair, he's going to raise.
Yeah.
And so I think firing all 3 for value is really a gimme play with any sort of even medium ace.
Okay. So medium ace, so you would say ace 9 or better, 3 streets?
I would say maybe even ace 6, ace 7 or better. Most of the times your opponents are going to 3-bet you with their mid-high aces anyways.
Yeah, his range is skewed. That's a real good point. Yeah, back to the 3-2 when I just open folded it. I wasn't sure how big. I know like if I was playing like 50, 100 or something, I would definitely want to probably raise the 3 deuce, but I didn't know at 10-20 how the rate.
The 3 deuce offsuit
was. Yeah.
Well, to give you an idea, I would be folding 3 deuce offsuit at 1,000, 2,000. So the rake impact is after a certain point. There is still some rake impact at a 10-20 game, and certainly as you move into very small limit games where the rake has a pretty large impact, you're going to fold some additional hands, even if you're displaying a pretty large edge over your opponents. But the very worst hands, I find, looking at a lot of empirical data and looking through my database, weren't quite profitable. But again, there were specific opponents where you could certainly play pretty much all your hands.
Okay.
And of course, those are the guys who give up too many hands pre-flop or just never bluff post-flop. That happens sometimes.
Here, I flop top pair. That's the nut. So I just figured check raise and then fire all 3 streets. Now I guess he had an ace high, king high there, and then when the 6th.
And it's interesting to note that, and that's something it's good to pay attention to. Is that your opponent might be willing to fold some weaker hands to a 3rd barrel there, and it can be tough to leverage that sometimes. But occasionally you get into a situation where you say that, hey, my opponent has this sort of hand, and this is a check raise I don't like, and we're going to pause the frame here and go through this. Because this is just a coordinated flop, and your opponent can hold so many hands that you are just not getting a good price to contest this flop. So, while it can be very lucrative to contest something like maybe even something like a queen 8 5 flop, you could consider check raising. But here your opponent will be oftentimes continuing deep with any 8, any jack, any queen, any 10, any 9. And because the board is so gut shot heavy, he may decide to call you down with any ace high, which he would on many boards. But this is just not the sort of flop you want to be attacking. You want to be attacking those dry, spaced-out flops, those paired flops, these 3 straight flops. There's just so many ways to have a piece of them that they're not profitable boards to attack.
Okay. And it kind of seemed like a bet. I guess against a more aggressive player, the guy had given up so much, I thought I might could get away with one, so to speak. I could check raise more flops, but
right, but
that's just there's still no way on.
Regardless of table image, if your opponent has a hand often enough on average, you just can't show a profit on the whole bluffing that.
Is that close on the river, my call?
I think that's a pretty easy call with top pair. I think many opponents might take a stab at you with a bottom pair sort of hand, or maybe they were calling down with ace high without a spade, and then they thought, well, I'm going to bet this river. And while I don't think that you'd win that pot too often, I do certainly like looking your opponent up.
Okay. Now, this is a spot where I just really don't know what to do on the turn. Let's say if the turn, if a nasty card like that rolls off, should I bet here, or is there, the guy's probably going to pill pretty wide here, but I'm also going to get rebluffed. So should I just check and give up?
Well, you have to consider what your opponent's range represents when he peels the flop. I think you'll find that most of your opponents will peel that flop with any 5, any pair, any 7, and oftentimes almost any 2 cards. Some people will peel that flop with king 10 with no piece of it. And so while the pot is, this is an unattractive situation to be in because there are a lot of ways for your opponent to have a hand, I think putting another bet in is not terrible. And again, this has gotten coordinated enough with the 3rd club that I certainly wouldn't make fun of you for trying to check fold in this situation either. I think it's very close. And it often depends. There are some opponents, I might draw the line that I would play against some opponents who would always raise me on the flop with a pair, and so when they just call, I would say, okay, well, they have gut shots here a lot, so I'm going to go ahead and bet again and hope that they don't have a club. Against other opponents, I might just give this one up.
I felt that my turn bet was almost a bluff, but that he could peel so lightly, it was something I needed to make. I didn't really know what to do.
And that's oftentimes what happens with limit hold'em, is that you're going to get into situations where you're going to fire the second barrel on quite a number of flops. Very rarely will you bet the flop after you 3-bet and then check fold the turn. You'll do it sometimes, but only on a small number of flops. And against many opponents, they just peel those flops very liberally, hoping that you do give up, and it's something they can do to cheaply contest pots.
Okay. Now, one other thing, I'm not exact. I mean, obviously with the 8-4 hand, when I get re-raised there on that board texture, I just can't continue. But how often in 3-bet, let's say if it was an 8-4, how often should I be peeling in a re-raised pot with when I just don't flop anything?
I think often enough to make sure your opponent continues to give you action when you do peel a flop, which doesn't have to be that often. If you're just peeling often enough, say that on the turn there's going to be 4 big bets in the pot. Well, if you only peel the flop with some sort of a junky hand a quarter of the time, your opponent's going to be getting a pretty good price to contest it.
Okay.
And of course, you're not doing so bad either because you have some outs to improve. And on the whole, that's going to be pretty good for your distribution.
Okay.
So while it does make sense to peel lightly sometimes, you don't need to do it a whole ton to encourage your opponent to continue betting.
Okay. And here, this is definitely just bet all 3 streets. And checking back on this turn here, I thought there was queen highs and such in there, and maybe some weaker hard draws that I could just bet fold this turn. I didn't know if I should check back or what exactly.
Well, I do like betting this turn again based on what you think your opponent can hold. I do like betting this turn again if you don't pair up, but this is kind of like that ace-10 hand we had earlier in the video, where you do have the option to check behind and induce a bet.
Okay.
And I think that can be a pretty strong option as well. Again, betting here is not terrible. If you think that your opponent might call another bet with queen high, some opponents will, seeing if you check down a worse hand. That can be a strong play too. But checking behind saves you a lot of hassle, and inducing a bluff goes a long way towards paying for those times that your opponent gets there and catches his queen or his 10 by you letting him see another street.
Well, if those cards come off and he bets the river, I just throw it away, right?
You do throw it away, but of course you still give him the pot.
Okay. And here, I didn't know if I should be calling and then waiting to check raise some of these turns on this particular board, because it's not one I would attack a whole bunch without a decent hand, but maybe if I would be check calling with ace highs there.
I'm not a big fan of waiting for the turn to check raise out of position. It's one of those things where you lose so much the times it doesn't work, and you gain just a little bit more the times it does work. And I think oftentimes, your opponents are going to be a bit more combative if you raise the flop right away anyways.
Okay. Now here I didn't know if I should just capping 3-bet, or cap and lead the turn and then call a raise, or should I call and then possibly call down. Now when I improve on the turn, I think obviously I'm going to probably go for a check raise here, but to be honest with you, I had no idea how much action I should put in.
Well, your flop play is mostly assumptions based, and it's going to be an idea of what hands you think your opponent would 3-bet with in position. Do you think that he's the kind of guy who 3-bets for a free card pretty liberally? Because if he's only 3-betting with top pair or better, you're not doing so hot against that range. So I think against many opponents you might call here, but against other opponents you might consider a cap.
Okay. Now my opponent's play here, he ends up having jacks. Now, if I was him and I had jacks there, would just calling a check raise and calling down be insane?
That's what I would do as well. And there would be, again, if you think about it from his point of view, if we're thinking about him as sort of being a sane sort of opponent, let's say that he thinks that you only check raise with top or middle pair. It's against that range of hands, he doesn't want to raise for value. There's no sense in doing that.
With the Jack 10, again, I wasn't sure if the guy's going to be peeling light there. Do I go ahead and bet, stick in one more bet and try to win?
Again, I think it's almost a give me to fire the second barrel, though. Many opponents will just peel that with an extremely wide range of hands that are giving up. If your opponent does happen to have a 9, of course the 6 pair there in the turn, but if he has a lower pair, you do have some equity as well.
Okay. Well, and I'm getting such a good price, I just couldn't resist. Now with the ace high there, I have good current equity against his range, but it seems like I'm not going to be able to play my hand, really.
No, it gets tough, and you kind of have to mix it up pretty well. But one thing that you can consider doing is against opponents...
Go ahead and pause this one, if you don't mind.
...who do continuation bet pretty liberally, you might let that one go, or you might call 2 streets if you feel that they bet air a lot. Against other opponents who give up pretty easily, you might just call there as a float, and then see if they check down a worse hand, which can be pretty effective. And one thing that can kind of be nice is that if you're going to check call, check fold some flops like that, is it may encourage your opponent to fire some second barrels in times that you're check calling with weaker hands, like weak 10s or under pairs or bottom pair. And so you can recover a bit of that value too in your other check calling hands, and it kind of helps balance your range a little bit. And so check calling and check folding some of the time is not a terrible play against some opponents.
Okay. Now back to this as kind of the I call and raise the turn, which is back to our original discussion about how often should I be peeling flops and contesting flops in these 3-bet pots when I just don't flop nothing. Because most of the time it seems like nobody's really going to flop anything.
Right.
So I didn't know. I mean, I guess I have maybe a bit of showdown value there, so I shouldn't have raised the turn.
Well, you do have a bit. I don't think you're ever going to get your opponent to lay down ace high. Is something that's a bit counterintuitive about that hand. And because you did have that 3 straight board texture on the turn with the sort of the double gut shot, again, there are so many hands that your opponent can continue with easily that although you might have some showdown value against them with queen high, that's a spot where once you got that turn card, I might let it go. But there's nothing wrong with taking one off on a dry flop like that and then raising some dry turns as well. It's a perfectly reasonable play. And again, calling down through queen high isn't really an alternative. So oftentimes you'd rather just raise and put the bluff in yourself rather than let him decide how often he wants to bluff in. So you control the bluffing frequency.
Okay. And here's when this on this particular flop, I check call, and I was going to try to check raise the turn, but you know, obviously we just went over that I should have check raised the flop, and then here I'm definitely not putting any more action when he 3-bets me and just calling down.
I think that's a pretty good play. That a lot of people might not make that distinction and say, well, I have 2 pair, that's a good hand, but it's good that you recognize that that's always a relative thing. And of course, on a board with a lot of straight potential, a lot of flush potential, of course your 2 pair isn't a very strong hand, and so just calling down there, of course, is the right play to make.
Deuces is kind of another spot where it's very similar to ace high. I was basically just check calling, and if he bet the turn, I was probably just going to give up. Now on the river, I think he bets any pair on the turn, so I really don't.
I think it's a very good value bet. Of course, you're going to be calling a bet probably if you check, so you may as well bet and make sure you get money in against ace high. Occasionally, you might hold something like bottom pair.
So I was actually thinking maybe that check fold was better than check call.
Oh, that's limit hold'em. You can't fold a pair on the river.
and here's another spot where I mean, this is probably a bad value bet.
I think this is a perfectly fine value bet to make. Your opponent checks behind the turn, so his entire range of hands is basically pairs of 4s and ace high. And the ace high might not always look you up, but the value bet is still, I think, the strong way to play it. And of course, in situations like that, you make the bet and see if your opponent can look you up.
Okay. And now here with the 10s, basically I was going to call and raise the turn, but now when this card rolls off on the turn, I just figured, hey, I just call him down because most of the hands that I'm going to get value from are going to bet anyway, and then I don't expose myself to a 3-bet, and I really don't want to fold my hand.
I wouldn't be so thrilled about raising the turn here. It's not a bad play, and I think it's all right. Certainly once the club comes in, certainly of course you don't want to raise because that's a portion of his range that's gotten there. But I think you'll find that most players are only going to be check raising flops like this with their strong draws, their pairs of jacks, and their stronger 8s. And against that range, there's not a whole ton of incentive to go ahead and raise. So I would probably just be calling down against most opponents. Some guys will check raise you on most flops with any pair. Those are the guys where you might start making value raises with your under pair sort of hands.
Okay.
And maybe stuff like ace 8 and your stronger middle pair hands as well.
Yeah, that makes real good sense. And contesting these flops, I mean, against this particular player, he doesn't seem to be rebluffing me much, so I think I can get away with contesting. Against more aggressive guys, I don't know if I could contest that flop all the time.
And that's something that I was actually talking to Kyle about recently here, was how on those dry flops, in a game theory optimal sense, there's a certain amount you want to bluff, but from a actual sort of real poker sense, Of course, the correct answer is that you want to bluff on those flops as much as you think you can get away with, because if your opponent just plays fit or fold, you're going to show a pretty good profit, in fact, a pretty impressive profit, check raising those types of flops. And so if your opponent's going to let you attack and attack and attack, do it. And don't worry about balancing if your opponent's going to let you get away with unbalanced play.
Okay, now on this hand, get 3-bet pre-flop, I flop a pair, that's good, so I'm going to call. Definitely there's no value in raising. Now the turn comes off, which is not a good card, but it's one he's going to continue with his entire range. So my thought process here, the pot's 100, I have to call 20. I have spade redraw and some 2-pair outs that are going to be good some of the time. Plus I maybe induce some bluffs here. So I was basically planning to call, and then if I don't improve on the river, maybe I don't know, maybe fold.
I think that's a pretty solid line, and this is a situation where you're in a pretty tough spot, because if you call this turn, he pretty much knows that you don't have the straight, so maybe even if he has some sort of crap hand, maybe he wants to go ahead and bet the river with any 2 cards and see if you can find a fold.
Okay.
But I think you're not going anywhere on the turn. With the price that you're getting to continue, the fact that occasionally he might check the river down with a worse hand, and of course you do have that spade draw that's good sometimes. There's not a whole ton of value in the call, but it's a call that's definitely worth making.
Okay, now if I had a red 3 there.
Well, you got a red 3, and I would definitely call with a red 3.
No. I'm saying if I don't have the 3 of spades, I think that is that enough to make me fold?
I think it's you have to consider it unless you think your opponent's re-raising range is really wide or really polarized, because it's a hard spot for him to continue betting as a bluff. It's just a situation where when you call that flop bet, you have to have a hand quite a bit. Once that ace peels off on the turn, either you have made some sort of straight or you have some sort of pair. And some people will try and bluff you off that range of hands, but most people will say, my opponent has something, I got to stop betting.
Okay, now on this flop, it seems it's a flop that's going to connect pretty well with his range, so I just try to check it down, and basically I was orphaning the pot, so if he put in any action, I was just going to give up that
I think once you get as far as the river, I would consider calling a bet. Those higher 3 straight boards are the ones that are actually probably would still consider taking a stab at, just because your opponent can still have some king, deuce, ace, deuce hands, which he'll probably pitch. When you get on the 3, 5, 6 boards, there's really not anything that most of your opponents seem to fold.
Okay. And with the 9 there, which I was not going to put any more action there. It was just going, unless I improved, and I improved. And now check raising this flop. Well, I've got, is that one? I mean, that's not, you don't have 3 high cards, but that's definitely a different texture than the Queen Jack 8 flop, so that's one I can get away with.
Only slightly different, and that's one that's still profitable to bluff.
Okay. And I have a, here, I've got a gut shot and a hard draw, pretty weak hard draw. Definitely not folding for one on the flop. If I didn't improve at all on the turn, I was going to throw it away. Maybe there would be some value in raising as a bluff.
Yeah, and I think this is something that, if you're going to put in 1 bet anyways, the pot's pretty big, and this hits a lot of hands in his range. We know that, but there are also some hands in his range, like maybe under pairs without any hearts, ace middle sort of hands without any hearts, or maybe even just weaker 3-betting hands like Jack 8, no hearts, that he can fold, and that's a small portion of his range, but the cost of putting an extra bet in is also small, because if your opponent's ahead, your net loss is not that big. You got a flush draw, you got a gut shot, and your outs aren't always live, but on the whole, they're doing pretty well for you. So I think raising here, even though you get re-raised some of the time, is the stronger play.
So you would definitely raise his turn.
I would raise the flop.
Oh, you
right
would
away.
Raise the flop? Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
And I would just think if my opponent had no pair, no heart, he would just say, well, he might have a semi-bluff, but I got to pitch my hand.
Okay. And as played on the turn, you would definitely raise the turn?
Yeah, as an alternative. I guess raising in one spot is as good as another. However, on the turn, I think that's perfectly fine.
Okay. Now with the king deuce hand, when the ace rolls off, I was thinking maybe I have showdown value on the turn. I considered checking and calling down, but then I figured that maybe betting to a deuce would actually be a better line there.
It's a reasonable consideration. Again, trying to get your king high to showdown there is perfectly reasonable. I think trying to move your opponent off a paired hand is something that's just not going to happen in a situation like that when you check raise that sort of board. It's a reasonable play. I think oftentimes I bet there anyways, just because I bet all my hands and all my bluffs there. But there's certainly a strong argument for checking, and so if you made that play, I would say again it's pretty reasonable. And if you think that you can induce a bluff by doing it, that's a perfectly reasonable play to make.
Okay. And would you have check raised the flop? Would you have contested that flop?
That's you didn't have a flush draw on the flop, right?
No, I flopped a flush draw.
Oh, you flopped a flush? Yeah, I would always check raise that.
Okay.
Because I want to. I like raising.
Okay.
That's my mentality. But also because I think that it just makes the hand a bit easier to play, and of course on the whole, if my opponent does have a pair, I've got 12 outs, so I don't really care on the flop. That's break-even money.
Okay. Now, as basically as we have discussed earlier in this video with the 4-5, I probably should have bet this turn here. I ended up checking it back and.
Well, you don't have to bet the turn. Either you're probably going to bet the turn, trying to get your opponent to fold the hand that he floats with, but you might think that your opponent doesn't peel this flop without any pair anyways, or maybe an ace high that wants to show down. You get a lot of opponents like that. And so on these sort of hard to peel flops, quote unquote, a lot of people treat a king 8 jack flop a lot differently than maybe a king 4-4 flop. You might just give up if he calls a flop.
I also thought another reason that I did not bet was the fact that I thought the jack might actually increase the amount of times that I get bluffed here, whereas if a deuce were to roll off, that I would be more inclined to bet. Is that thought process?
I don't think it makes a big difference. I don't think too many people are going to call the flop intending to bluff the turn. It's not going to come up too much. The biggest thing I think, well, not the biggest thing I think, but the most important information to have here, or that you got to decide, is how often do you think your opponent peels this flop without a pair?
Okay. And on the river, I really wasn't sure because the pot's kind of small, but I was like, hey, I got a pair. I can't fold.
That's pretty good limit holding mentality. Now, of course, the one interesting argument is if you think your opponent doesn't have a pair here often enough that it's profitable for you to call this river bet, maybe then it also makes sense for you to fire the turn. In fact, it does make sense to a point. But there are a couple hands that overlap there, and it also means that maybe there are some hands that you can't beat with a bet on the turn, like bluffs that are going to raise and semi-bluffs that will raise, but you can't beat them by calling a bet on the river.
Okay. His bet with threes there on the river, that's a pretty standard value bet because of all the ace-high combos that'll pay me off?
Pretty much. When you check behind there, you don't have a jack. Some people might have a king and they don't want to get check raised by a jack, but it's, again, you'll find it's a pretty normal check raise for most people to make.
Okay, now back to the last hand, the 8-7-4 board texture. Actually, you can just take it off pause. We can discuss it. The board texture on that's really not one that I want to be attacking because he's going to peel there. There's so many combinations of hands. Probably 60% of his range he peels.
Don't touch that flop without a piece of it. Okay. It's so hard for your opponent to have nothing on a flop like that.
And on this river, if, let's say, one of the middle cards is 6, 7, 8 or a come, could I have folded the river, given if one of those cards would have gamed?
It's not terrible, of course. There's nothing wrong with folding your ace high once some of the draws come in and your opponent bets all 3 streets. But at the same time, there's something to be said for looking at your opponent, especially a guy you don't know too well, and get an idea of what he's doing. Okay. It's certainly the sort of board where people can just check raise it with any 2 cards, and if you're going to lay down some hands, they'll show a profit. So one thing you might find that's important for you to know there is whether or not you think your opponent would 3-barrel, fire all 3 streets with a bluff in a situation like that. If you think that he doesn't, maybe you want to lay down your hand. If he's the sort of guy who is just going to automatically barrel off, then maybe you want to go ahead and look him up. Now, in that last hand there with a 3-7, that's another good example of bet folding the turn isn't bad. I don't think
with my flush draw.
You had a flush draw?
I had a flush draw on the turn.
It's still pretty hard for you to get looked up by worse hands. It's easy for you to get check raised by a 9, though.
Yes.
Which is not a big deal.
I thought I might induce action, and I have a pretty good bit of equity. I might induce from some middle cards that are now going to peel and bluff. Jack 10, Queen Jack.
I think you'll find that's a pretty uncommon play. Most people are going to be running their bluffs pretty fast. It's not a thing that happens necessarily, but I think you'll find that's a pretty common trend in limit hold'em play. There's no real rhyme or reason to it. That's just the way it's done. And in fact, there is some rhyme and reason to it, but I'm sure most people don't do it for the most logical reasons. But we'll play their draws pretty fast.
Okay, so it was definitely just check behind. If he checks me on the river, I value bet my 3s, right?
No, I would value bet it. I would expect that. Well, you saw him value bet to pocket 3s on it was like a King Jack Jack 8 something else board, King Jack Jack 8-4. So if he's going to be betting any pair and he checks it to you, well, either he's check raising you, which is a possibility, but we haven't seen anything like that yet, or he's got ace high.
Yeah. Okay. Makes sense.
It's just kind of one of those situations where your opponent doesn't really have a better hand than you, so you may as well bet and see if you can find a way to look you up.
Okay. Now, should I have continued here? Put in one more?
You know what? I think you'll find most people won't give up their ace. Betting again is not a bad play. Like if you think your opponent would lay down ace no pair there, I think it's a strong play. But if you think that he would call another street with an ace, you want to just let that one go.
Okay. Well, I didn't feel comfortable firing two barrels. I thought if I was gonna have to bet there, I was gonna have to fire two barrels.
Yeah, well, possibly. That's something to consider. But I think giving up on the whole is usually the stronger play.
Okay.
And I like this check raise here. This is a pretty perceptive play.
Well, I didn't think he would pill that flop that often without a decent piece, so I thought I had some value there. And if he's probably going to bet every draw that he did pill with.
Did you see that he called you turn raise with Jack high?
He had a flush draw.
Oh, did he? Okay.
Yeah, he had a flush draw river to pair. I thought his flop pill was pretty thin.
Well, that's sort of the way I think a lot of people overdo it with making sort of a spectacle out of peeling a lot of flops loosely after a 3-bet to make sure their opponent gives them a lot of action when they call flops. You don't have to do that every single hand. You can just do it, one hand in 5 is plenty.
Okay. And that was like the 7-10. I figured if I call there and turn a 10 or a 7, I would raise.
Oh, with the 7-10? Quite easily. Your opponent's still representing pretty much his entire 3-betting range when he fires that turn barrel. That includes a lot of ace high and some worse pairs too. Some people will also look you up with king high as well.
And if I get 3-bet, I definitely have to call down.
Oh, it's a little bit hold'em.
I have pair. I thought actually about maybe check raising this turn.
Well, here's a good rule of thumb though: is if you have a hand that's strong enough for a bet 3-bet, don't try and check raise. Go for the bet.
Nice. Okay. Is checking back and giving up on this flop?
I would take a stab.
You would take a stab? Okay, and here raising the turn seems a bit silly.
Why does it seem silly to you?
It seems silly because I just don't know if I have... Well, let me rethink that statement. Although I guess I do have... if I bet raise the turn, I'm definitely going to have to fire the river. I have some equity here, so I've got, let's say, 18% equity with my straight draw. And I can fold out all the Jack 9, Jack 8, 9, 6, all those middle draw combos, and possibly a flush draw. So in hindsight, actually, I think raising is probably a better play than.
I think on a dry flop like this, a raise when you improve to an open-ended straight on the turn is a gimme play. There are so many draws your opponent can hold, and oftentimes what you're doing when you're raising back with your semi-bluffs in limit hold'em and heads-up limit hold'em especially is you're not trying to get your opponent to fold a pair. I don't think your opponent will ever fold a pair if you raise and bet the river here. But a large portion of his range is semi-bluffs. And the guy who's betting with his bluff always beats the guy who's calling with his bluff. And so you want to make sure that you sort of have the last word on the river and you're going to get the last bet in because, a bluff or a bet beats a bluff. You don't have to have a strong hand to beat it. And so, if you're already putting one bet in here with a call, you may as well put another bet in with a raise. You do have some equity when you're behind, and fire a river bet. And a large enough portion of his range is going to be draws. That's going to be justifiable.
Okay. I think I just call here. Yeah, I'm a fish.
A super tricky player might consider calling and raising the river.
Yeah.
Maybe not necessarily this river. That's a river that you would probably look at that and say, well, everything got there. I'm done with my hand.
Yeah, that just makes my head explode. I'm not sure. No, I don't fold. On this turn, if I call here, I basically have to call with intention of calling the river.
A non-spade river, a non-spade, non-7, non-5 river. Again, it's a situation where there are a lot of draws. Folding isn't terrible there. The board got pretty coordinated. I would probably call intending to call a pretty blank river. But one thing to remember is that you're not getting a terrible price to call and see if you improve to a better pair, which will often be best. Like you're getting.
Yeah, well, I've got that equity there.
Yeah. So what are you getting on that turn bet there? You're getting 4-1.
Yeah, I'm getting 4-1. Yeah.
4-1, and you only do have 6 outs that are good some of the time, but also your hand is best some of the time, and so calling there is certainly a reasonable play, but folding certainly isn't bad. It got to be a pretty coordinated board, and there are a lot of ways that your opponent can have some piece of that, and even if he doesn't have a piece, there are a lot of ways that he now holds a lot of outs to improve off of a 10-outer or something like that.
And here they're seeing no value at all in raising that. Check calling is the best line. Maybe the king highs. And on this turn, I was actually probably just going to, I was going to check and call and then maybe fold the river. But now, when the 10 pairs off, I wasn't sure if I should value bet this because I thought all the combos in middle pocket pairs that might check that back, and
you can try and get off cheap. Like again, if you're betting, you're value betting against king high, which may not even look you up if he holds that hand after the 10 peels off on the turn. So you can make the value bet, but it would be a pretty thin bet.
Okay. I was planning on calling and raising the turn here, but now when the 9 rolls off, I don't see any reason to raise the turn, so it's just called out.
Yeah, and it's a bit of a tough showdown for you to make, but again, on the river, you still beat a couple diamond draws. You beat any 4, which may fire both streets. You know, but again, you also lose to any 8, any 9, a lot of 7s, any 6 at this point, any 2-pair hand. I wouldn't call you crazy for folding on the river there, but I think you know, looking him up is certainly not a bad play.
Okay. See, I thought the river call was pretty cut and dry, but now in hindsight, I guess
it's one of those situations where once you get that far into the hand, your hand looks so strong that it's difficult for your opponent to bluff you. But again, I think your call is good. But I'm also pointing out that I think it's also close.
Okay. Now on this flat peel, I'm getting 9-1 to peel there. I have a decent amount of equity, so I figured I would. Check folding seems bad to me.
Yeah, no, I think it's a perfectly reasonable play. And one thing to point out is, oftentimes if you call a flop like that when you're out of position, your opponent might decide to give you a free card.
Okay.
And so on the whole, you're getting probably a pretty good price to draw to improve. And it's good for you overall in the sense that, again, your opponents might start barreling you a bit more liberally when you do have a weak hand. You know, and one way or the other, something good has to happen. Either they have to give you more action, or they'll give you more free cards. Your opponents can't do both, and very few opponents strike a good balance between the two.
Okay. On here, I flop open trips, and it was definitely bet. Now the question is, should I check raise the turn?
Again, you have a hand that's good enough to bet 3 bets, so I would never go for a check raise here.
Okay. Now I find this pretty interesting that he raised the turn. I guess he did it with a draw there.
Could be a flush draw, could be 9-10.
Yeah.
A lot of reasonable hands to play that way.
On this flop, I may just give up outright. Or no, I think I peel one, and then...
I would always start with the call here,
okay.
and then I would go ahead and consider raising a turn like this. And we're getting towards the end of the video here. I think this is the last hand, but this is a good example of a situation where the board is really polarized away from your opponent's range. So this is a good spot to take a shot at him. I'd say this is as good a situation as any to call and raise the turn, hoping that he will muck a queen high or a king high sort of hand.
Yeah, that's I didn't even. When you said polarized away from his range, that hit home with me. That makes a lot of sense.
Okay, so that's it for this video, and I hope you guys have enjoyed it.
All right, see y'all later.